Good evening to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our next update on what is now Hurricane Beryl, rapidly intensifying still. Just this time yesterday, we were talking about not about only tropical depression number two in the Atlantic. Now it is rapidly intensified into Hurricane Beryl, not even tropical storm Beryl anymore. And that is only going to continue over the next day or so as we're potentially looking at a major hurricane impact to the Windward Islands. So let's not waste any time in getting started in this evening's update. First off, Hurricane Beryl in the eastern MDR, and it's quite incredible. We're talking about hurricane in the eastern MDR for this time of year. Beryl definitely came earlier than expected in terms of it being a hurricane, although I did say this morning that I would not be shocked if it did become a hurricane later today. Honestly, did not expect it to be this early though, but nonetheless, it is a hurricane. 75-mile-per-hour winds with a minimum central pressure of 992 millibars. And if you're tracking it, it's located at 10.1 north, 49.3 west, and it is moving west at 22 miles per hour. So still moving west at a pretty brisk pace. And it'll continue to do so over the next several days as it gets closer towards the Windward Islands. But once again, it is now a hurricane. It is forecast, and the National Hurricane Center headline for Beryl even says this: expected to bring life-threatening winds and storm surge to the Windward Islands as a major hurricane. And I think that sums up what to expect out of Beryl very greatly. It is a hurricane, the first hurricane, first and foremost, to be a hurricane in June in 12 years. The last time we had a hurricane this early on in the hurricane season in June was 2012 with Hurricane Chris. And 2012 was actually a pretty active year. We had storms like Sandy, which is very infamous, especially for my neck of the woods here in the Northeast. But to have a hurricane this far east in the MDR this early on in the season, this is something that we've actually not seen before. This is actually something I will say that it is indeed unprecedented that we've seen a hurricane this far east in the Atlantic, deep tropics, in June. And it is definitely very, very shocking and bizarre for sure. And it just goes to show just how favorable the atmosphere is ahead of this storm, meaning that we have Hurricane Beryl right now. And once again, it is expected to probably strengthen into a major hurricane very soon. National Hurricane Center, I'll show you the cone in a moment, but the National Hurricane Center says by Monday morning, won't even shock me at this point if it does so tomorrow. This is a satellite image, though, of Beryl, and you can definitely see why it's a hurricane now. It's continued to organize. Earlier today, it did look a little bit disheveled. As I mentioned, there were issues with shear and dry air, especially easterly shear, given that this storm is moving very quickly this time of year, given that the trades in the Atlantic are very strong this time of year. But it's managed to hold up. We're managing to see lots of deep convection firing, especially near the center, and you can see the way that convection is curling the way it is. That's indicative that it's forming an inner eye wall. And in fact, I actually have a tweet by Eric Webb that he mentioned an hour ago when we had the most recent microwave pass. The microwave imagery, by the way, meaning a satellite tool that we use to look at the structure, the inner sort of internal structure of the convection in a tropical cyclone. And he mentions that a later microwave pass from AMSR similarly shows Beryl possesses a formative eye wall under the hood, which is likely open to the northeast up shears on the up shear side of the circulation. So basically, he's mentioning in this microwave imagery, we have an eye wall forming, but we're still open to the northeastern side. And he mentions that, however, the shallow top convection is lurking and building underneath, may eventually round out the rest of this primitive eye wall later during tonight's diurnal maximum, leading to much greater rates of intensification. So we have an eye wall forming right now. It's not closed yet, but he mentions as we go throughout the rest of the night into diurnal maximum, meaning the time of the day, because the oceans actually have specific times of day that they're naturally most convective, and the most convective period in the ocean, we call it the diurnal maximum, that usually happens around sunrise in the ocean. And usually around that time is when these tropical cyclones, and as Beryl has been proving throughout its life cycle so far, they tend to thrive the most during these periods. And so it's very interesting that we have a eye wall forming right now. You could definitely see that that is the case if you're looking at the satellite imagery, especially once again with the way these convective bands are kind of curling, or convective bursts, I should say. They're kind of curling, definitely indicative of an eye wall in the making. And that's a sign, once again, of Beryl just continuing to intensify. And we could see that here on the 5 p.m. National Hurricane Center forecast discussion. They also mentioned this as well. Right from the first paragraph, Beryl continues to rapidly strengthen and has now become a hurricane. Satellite images show expanding central dense overcast feature, and recent microwave images, what we just showed a few seconds ago, indicates that a partial eye wall has formed, and because of that, they are in agreement that this is a hurricane. And Beryl is also a compact tropical cyclone, and this is also very important too. Its tropical storm force winds extend up 50 nautical miles from the center. And we'll also get more information about Beryl, since hurricane recon is expected tomorrow. So we'll get more information tomorrow about what is expected out of Beryl. But it is a hurricane now, and it definitely continues to be on the pace of intensification. We have an eye wall forming, and that is definitely a sign of an intensifying system. And obviously, Beryl is only going to intensify further. This is what the National Hurricane Center forecasts is for its intensification. A peak, roughly, potentially within the next 48 hours only, of up to 120 miles an hour. And you could see on the National Hurricane Center cone, they even expect this by early Tuesday. Probably, in my opinion, if we continue at this current rate of intensification, Beryl might even be a major hurricane sometime tomorrow. Depends on if it's tomorrow morning. If it's tomorrow morning, that would be really insane. Just pointing it out right now. I gotta keep it real. It will be really crazy if it's a hurricane tomorrow morning. If it's a major hurricane tomorrow morning. It's already a hurricane now. This is happening all so fast, that sometimes I can get it mixed up. But the bottom line is that either way, Beryl is likely to become a major hurricane. Hurricane warnings are now in effect, by the way, for Barbados. So if you're in Barbados, and the entire Windward Islands as well should be, if you're in the Windward Islands right now, you should be getting your preparations started. And then by tomorrow afternoon and evening latest, I suggest that your hurricane preparations should be rushed to completion, as we'll probably start seeing tropical/hurricane force winds, or tropical storm force winds in the very least, should start reaching some of these Windward Islands by late tomorrow evening. And then we have major hurricane expected as this marches into the Eastern Caribbean, and it remains a hurricane probably as it continues into the Central and Western Caribbean, although there is a lot of uncertainty right now in the day 4 and 5 range on its exact intensity, and its intensity too will also depend on its track. So I would really, once again, not focus as much right now on where it's going to be at day 4 or 5, especially because we have an imminent threat with this within the next 36 to 48 hours that will likely see a landfall from the storm, now looking very likely as a major hurricane too. So really wouldn't focus much past the next 36 to 48 hours. And I think this really is well represented if we look at the model guidance from Beryl. It says tropical storm still, but trust me, it's a hurricane. Over the next 24 to 48 hours, we have most certainty, obviously. A lot of the models obviously agreeing that this will move into the Windward Islands. And then as we get towards hour 72, the model guidance, I would say, is pretty compact, and they are in general agreement that this will be around a similar location as it enters the Eastern Caribbean. But notice, as we get past the hour 72 mark, which is roughly getting past the island of Hispaniola, notice, and this is where the uncertainty part of the model guidance comes in, We start seeing tracks a little bit further to the north. Some have them, some have them a little bit further to the south. We see as well some trying to enter the Gulf. There's a lot of uncertainty, bottom line, past the 3 day mark associated with Beryl, and that's really going to be dependent on its progress, or not progress, its general what it does as it enters the Eastern Caribbean. It's really going to impact what happens in the Central and Western Caribbean. So interests right now, I will say, if you're in Jamaica or if you're in Cuba, or even if you're in the island of Hispaniola, anywhere in either Haiti or even the Dominican Republic, I'd say watch an eye onto the tropics, and especially over the next 48 to 60 hours, watch closely with what Beryl does, because that'll really determine what its track will be later on. And obviously, as I will say, for right now, and I know it's a really hard thing for a lot of people, especially along the Gulf Coast, to hear, given how things have been in hurricane season over the last several years in the Gulf Coast. But as of any sort of U.S. interests right now with Beryl, I will say it is too early to really be able to determine that at this point. We still need several more days to get a general idea, not even a good idea, but a general idea of what Beryl will be like past the Eastern Caribbean. So let's get that settled. Hopefully we got that settled. Let's take a look at the models now, at least the 12Z models. So this morning's / this early afternoon's model guidance, and this is the GFS. Moving it out into the next 12, 24, 48 hours, you can see here Monday morning and then into Monday afternoon, the GFS has the storm deepening as low as 964 millibars. That's probably a Category 2, Category 3 hurricane that the GFS has approaching the islands. And then you could see, very importantly, that the GFS weakens this after it hits the islands, and then it kind of goes a little bit further north. And then behind that, you can see that we do indeed have that other area that we're going to watch. And the GFS on this run, the 12Z run, too, also makes the area behind Beryl, which I mentioned earlier today. Seems like the 12Z actually does also make this a pretty formidable tropical system as well. And it definitely seems like it tries to make it a hurricane as it enters the Caribbean too. Once again, I would not try to focus as much on this threat yet, because we got to get past Beryl right now. But if there's any sort of time frame that I'll point out with this, it'll probably be, once again, sometime mid to late next week. Once we get past Beryl, it looks like we have to watch the tropics again, as there might be another area that we need to watch. Unfortunately, for the islands, it's definitely a lot of activity that's happening, but what can we do, especially with a year like this that is really favorable? But the GFS, I think, bottom line, going back to Beryl, the GFS has it as, I don't want to do that, as a probably Category 2, maybe even major hurricane by then, approaching the islands. Let's see what it shows right now. Basically, it shows exactly where it should be, 992 millibars at the 18Z. So this afternoon, they show it at 992 millibars. So it's right on the target in terms of its current intensity right now. So that is one model. Initializing the storm well, and they seem to show it becoming a major hurricane as it enters the island. So that's one model. And this is really something that is surprising. The European, as of the 12Z run, I always talked about how the European has been more or less, I believe, a fail mode for Beryl in terms of it potentially not becoming, well, one, not becoming a hurricane. Well, that's obviously out the window now because it is a hurricane. But two, probably not doing as much as all the other models were in terms of it potentially being a major near the islands. Well, the European doesn't necessarily make this a major near the islands, but it does strengthen this as of the 12Z run pretty decently. And as you can see, Monday afternoon, there is a 978 millibar storm that is crossing the Windward Islands, probably either St. Lucia or St. Vincent and the Grenadines, or at least that's what I could see from this perspective of the model. But the bottom line, it's a hurricane now in the European as well that is crossing the islands. And then as it enters the Caribbean, Similar to, actually different than the GFS, the European intensifies this further. And if it's not a major hurricane by the islands, the European definitely probably has this at least at Category 2 or Category 3 intensity, even by the time it gets into the Eastern Caribbean as well. And I should also mention, too, that this will probably continue to intensify past the islands. So I'd say Beryl's peak will probably be most likely in the Eastern Caribbean, and that'll also have an impact, a huge impact on its track later on too. And then we see obviously Beryl moves into the Central Caribbean, but as of right now, the European doesn't really show the other wave as much. That's kind of the better case scenario, that this wave behind Beryl doesn't form, and that's what the European shows. Although not really sure about how that'll play out, really, especially given they were very much so far on the weak side with Beryl. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see how things shape up. And maybe the European will be right about this other wave. But going back to Beryl right now, that is another model that is very confident on a hurricane for the island. So we got that out of the way. Let's see what the hurricane models now show. You know the drill. We got to go through all these models. Got to really break it down for you. So here's the H-Wharf as of the 12Z run. Brings this as a 958 millibar storm on Monday afternoon, 18Z, into the islands. Let's see what its intensity is. Right at major hurricane intensity. So the H-Wharf thinks that this will be right as a major hurricane approaching the islands. And then it has this intensifying even further as it gets into the Caribbean. And because of that, it takes it further north, and it seems like that brings it much more of a threat to the Northern Caribbean because of it going a little bit further north. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the days to come. But in terms of whether or not this will be a major hurricane approaching the islands, the H-Wharf does indeed think so. So that's another model. What about the H-Mon? The H-Mon seems to... Actually, no, it does pretty well with the initialization of the storm. The H-Wharf brings this, not the H-Wharf, we just looked at the H-Wharf, the H-Mon, I'm sorry, intensifies this also very quickly. Similar intensity to the H-Wharf, 957, 958 millibars. The sound outside is really loud, I apologize for that. H-Mon brings this as also a major hurricane. A stronger one, though, they have 111 knots, so that's a high-end Category 3 approaching the islands. And then it obviously continues to intensify, although not as much. It kind of levels out once it passes the islands, and then it kind of remains on a more steady intensity on the H-Mon. But still a major hurricane on approach to the islands, and a major hurricane as it's traversing through the Eastern Caribbean that we have on the H-Mon model. What about the other models? Let's see the HAFS A. And this one is going to be a really interesting one, especially given that this one was the least aggressive of all the hurricane models, in that it only showed a moderate Category 1, maybe high-end Category 1 approaching the islands. Well, this run, they also show a major hurricane approaching the islands. Pressure is a little bit weaker, but wind speed, they have it at 100 knots, so 111 knots, so that's basically Category 3 intensity on approach to the islands. Probably, I guess, higher pressure because it is a smaller storm, and obviously the pressure will not be as low as if this was a much bigger storm. That's another thing for you. Smaller, more compact storms sometimes tend to have higher general pressures, given that they are not huge and expansive. So that's probably the case that the HAFS A has, and that's a major hurricane Monday afternoon as it's crossing the Windward Islands. This one seems to think that it'll go south of St. Vincent and probably through the Grenadine Islands, and then it moves into the Caribbean, and then it kind of maintains its intensity. And then finally, the HAFS B model. Let's see what it does. Basically the same camp as the H-Wharf, as all of the models. That's all four of them making this a major hurricane on approach to the islands. So I think the bottom line that I'm trying to get at, going through all of these runs and seeing whether or not they bring this on approach to the islands, is to kind of, I guess, validate the National Hurricane Center forecast, in that they show basically 120 miles per hour or so as this is moving through the islands into the Eastern Caribbean, showing that there is certainty that Beryl will probably be a major hurricane as it crosses the islands. This will probably be a very significant storm, and it's looking very much likely now that it will be the case. And I'll show you in the model intensity guidance too. Almost all of them now bring it up to at least Category 3 intensity. Have a few of these small little model guidance things here that don't really bring it up to major hurricane intensity, but now most, if not all of them, do make it a hurricane in the very least. So that is very much important. So that at least settles the fact that this will probably be a hurricane once it approaches the islands. I mean, it's already a hurricane either way, so it's very much likely that it'll be a hurricane once it approaches the islands. But the model guidance is getting very certain that this will be potentially up to Category 3 intensity. Still, few show Category 4, like the H-Wharf, although we'll see if they're on the camp. If the H-Wharf is in a camp of its own right now and showing a Category 4, or maybe if this uptrends in intensity even further, we might as well be looking at a Category 4 as well for Beryl soon. Once again, it really will depend on what it does over the next several hours heading into tomorrow and through tomorrow as well. But really quickly, before I want to end it off, a kind of funny tweet, or funny in a way if you're familiar with climatology. This storm is definitely not funny in any way at all, but this is a tweet from a very, I guess, kind of funny tweet I found. And this guy, Dennis, I'm not going to really try to pronounce his last name because I don't want to screw it up, but he mentions, here's a comprehensive map of all the major hurricanes that have hit the Lesser Antilles in the month of July. And you can see there's nothing on the map, because what is happening right now with Beryl is pretty unprecedented. We've not had a major hurricane pass through the islands in the month of July. And he goes on to mention that the closest we've gotten was Hurricane Emily, and that was back in 2005, a very memorable season that I think we all remember. And the fact that we have something, that we're going to get something even beyond 2005, and also, by the way, Emily happened in mid-July too. As this crosses the islands on Monday, it's going to be July 1st. Just to put into perspective what exactly is happening with Beryl. So it's definitely anomalous, and I'm not doing this to scare everybody, but I'm just really trying to put it into perspective, just to keep it real with how unusual what Beryl is going to do. How unusual it is for something of this magnitude to happen this early on in the season. And I'm telling you, it is certainly a precedent for what is to come later on in the season. The Atlantic is very warm, and that's partially fueling Beryl with how quickly it's intensifying, especially for late June. The Atlantic is anomalously warm. The atmosphere is also very primed. And as a result, we're seeing the fruit of it once again with Beryl, Hurricane Beryl now, and potentially major Hurricane Beryl within the next day or so. Even wouldn't even shock me at this if we're sitting here this time tomorrow and we're talking about major Hurricane Beryl. We'll have to see though. That's not all the coverage I'm going to do for today though. I'm going to tell you right now, expect a live stream around 8 o'clock Eastern time tonight. So if you're not subscribed yet to the channel and you want the notification for that, please subscribe now. And also like this video as well. If you really found this video informative to you, and this was helpful in kind of putting things in perspective in any sort of way, I would really appreciate it if you give this a like, share with family and friends as well if you live in the islands, or if you have people that are going to be impacted in some of these islands by Beryl passing. I would really encourage you to send this their way and inform them of what is going on. We got to definitely spread the word and make everybody as prepared as possible so we can minimize the loss of life. Obviously, we can only do so much, especially given a storm like Beryl that is probably going to be very strong. But we could do our part and prepare to the best of our ability with what we got. And I definitely encourage you, if you live in the islands right now, especially in Barbados where there's a hurricane warning, but I'd imagine for sure that the Windward Islands, the rest of them, will probably follow suit very shortly in releasing hurricane warnings. If you're in all of the Windward Islands right now, tonight, I definitely encourage you to start your hurricane preparations now and rush them to completion once again, latest tomorrow evening. With that being said, though, once again, watch out for my live streams tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So in less than 2 hours from now, stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll see each other again very soon.